In 1822, there was a doctor in Sussex, England. He was making a house call, and he was taking care of a patient, and his wife was out walking along the countryside. And as she was walking, she came upon a road where they filled in potholes with rocks from a nearby rock quarry, and there were piles of those rocks that were lying on the side of the road. And she looked down and she saw something that was unusual, something that she knew her husband would be interested in because he was an amateur fossilologist. At the time, that's kind of what they called it. It was just somebody who collected fossils of animals that once lived. And so she picked this thing up, knew her husband, Gideon Mantell, Dr. Mantell, would be interested in it. So she took it back to him and she showed it to him, and he was fascinated with it. In fact, he had never seen anything like it. In 1822, this was the first of its kind, at least the first that anybody recognized it for what it really was. He started looking at it and realized it was a tooth, a fossilized tooth. But it was not a normal fossilized tooth, at least not a normal sized fossilized tooth. It was huge. It was massive. It was bigger than just about any tooth anybody had seen. And so they took it to some animal doctors, what's the word I was looking for? They took it to Richard Owen later, who was the word has just left me, and I have used that word 1,000,000 times. And what's that? Well, not a veterinarian. He was thank you though, it was a zoologist. Back then they didn't really even have that term. It was they didn't really have that term. It was anatomist. That was it. Just an animal anatomist is the word I'm looking for. Although that doesn't even, anyway, you guys were close, but some of those they didn't even come up with until later. So they took it to him, and they said, you know what, this looks like, it's a big tooth, but it must be like an elephant tooth. They said, does it look anything like an elephant tooth to you? And the anatomist said, well, no, it doesn't really look like an elephant tooth, but it's so big. It's got to be something like that. They said, well, not buying it. I don't think it's an elephant tooth. And so then another one said, well, it must be something like a rhinoceros tooth. And they said, does it look like a rhinoceros tooth? And it didn't look anything like a rhinoceros tooth. So they said, no, not a rhinoceros tooth. So they found a tooth that it looked just like an iguana tooth, except it was 20 times bigger than an iguana tooth. Iguana tooth about this big, the tooth that they found about this big. And so they named the creature Iguanodon. That word don, D-O-N, orthodontist, a place where you go get something done to your teeth. Iguanodon just simply meant iguana tooth. They didn't have any idea what the creature was. In fact, as the anatomists tried to put it together, they put it together horrendously wrong at first, and they made it look like nothing that it actually turns out to look like, but this was new ground they were breaking. Iguanodon, a huge creature that had a tooth just like an iguana, but we have no idea what else it looked like. 1822. That was the first identification of a creature that comes to be known about 20 years later as a dinosaur. That word dinosaur means a fearfully great or terribly great lizard. From 1822 to about 1841, there was a massive rush to find these fossils of these huge lizards, and people found thousands of them. In fact, all over the world, from virtually every single continent, these dinosaur fossils started popping up. Of course, the name dinosaur, they didn't really know what to call them until 1841, and that's when a British anatomist named Sir Richard Owen in 1841, 1842 came up with the English word dinosaur, which meant fearfully great or very big, or we might just say really huge lizard. That's what it means. You know how fascinating dinosaurs are? If you go to a book fair, my son at school, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, went to a book fair. There are sections for all kinds of things. There at the book fair, you got mystery sections, you got your little pins and gadgets and gizmos section, and then there is an entire huge section. I think I counted 20 books or so, 15, dedicated completely and solely to dinosaurs. There might be one other horse book or two, maybe one or two puppy books, but 20 to 25 dinosaur books. Why is that? Well, because they're just so awesome. They're so amazing. I mean, you start looking at some of these dinosaurs, the largest land-living creatures that ever existed, a Tyrannosaurus rex, king tyrant lizard. Tyrannosaurus rex had a skull that was about the size of this table, just his head. He had 60 razor-sharp, pointed steak knife-like teeth. They have real serration on them, just like a steak knife. They're designed perfectly to literally cut through meat. A Tyrannosaurus rex could eat in one single bite 500 pounds of meat and shave it off like a butcher working in the back of Winn-Dixie. An amazing creature, stood 20 feet tall at its hips. So you're looking at about the ceiling. That would be about, I'm going to say, right at 20 or so. That's where his hips stood. When he stood upright, he would be more than that, 28 to 30. He was 41 feet long. Massive creatures. And of course, he's not nearly even the biggest one. There are some of those huge plant-eating dinosaurs that look like this. The hippopotamus is there for comparison. This Brachiosaurus, a huge plant-eating dinosaur with massive internal structures and legs that individually are almost the size of an entire hippopotamus. Some of these creatures, the Seismosaurus, the Titanosaurus, the Argentinosaurus, they were 125 feet long or so, 116 tons. That's over 200,000 pounds. They had massive, here's what they would do, lots of these big plant-eating dinosaurs, they would swallow big rocks the size of bowling balls, that they would keep in their stomachs to help them digest all the food that they ate. They were called gastroliths. As we find the fossils of these massive dinosaurs located right about there, we will find large piles of very smooth rocks that they have swallowed, very much like a dove or a pigeon will do when they're pecking on that gravel and they're getting it there in their gizzard to help them process that grain and corn or wheat or whatever it is that they are eating. That's what these creatures did. Huge creatures. You've seen movies about them, I'd say. Jurassic Park 27. I mean, it's pretty close to out now, isn't it? Jurassic World Park Planet. Something. The next has got to be Jurassic Planet. I remember when I was, I guess I was in my teen years or so, the first Jurassic Park came out. And they presented to you the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Of course, you almost can't have a dinosaur movie without Tyrannosaurus Rex. But then they presented this other one that nobody had really ever seen before. You remember what they called that creature? That could, Velociraptor. Massive, looked like about a 6.5-foot dinosaur. They gave it characteristics almost human, which it certainly didn't have, but it could supposedly communicate almost with humans, almost like it could talk, because it was supposed to be one of the smartest dinosaurs because it had largest brain per body size of most any dinosaur, and 6.5 feet, it could jump 9 or 10 feet at a time. Interesting dinosaur. Yeah, you know the problem with that particular velociraptor? Oh, there is a velociraptor. Do you know how big a velociraptor actually is? If the velociraptor were standing in this pew right here, the velociraptor would come up about to my chest. Velociraptor is about 3 feet tall. They pictured him in the movie with a massive claw that could rip through a person and basically de-entrail a person with one little rip. The claw was about that big. You could have probably taken care of it with some pretty good toenail clippers. They blew up the velociraptor 400% of what they knew it to be. Why would you do that? Well, I mean, if you're walking through a jungle and you've got a belt-feed 12-gauge shotgun full of buckshot and a 3-foot creature comes up to you, who wins? That one. Oh, well, you do with the belt-feed buckshot. But if it's a 6.5-foot dinosaur that can jump 10 feet and get out of your way very quickly, it makes it for It makes for a much more scary movie, doesn't it? Just a less accurate one, but much scarier one. And so what you find is there is a lot of information out there about dinosaurs, and some of it's exactly right. Hey, guess what? A Tyrannosaurus Rex really was 20 feet tall at the hips. We've got bones that show that to be the case, but Velociraptor wasn't 6.5 feet tall. We've got bones that show it to only be 3.5. So what are we saying here? Some of the information about dinosaurs that you're going to read and see in magazines and books and movies, it's exactly right. Some of it is not right. So the question tonight is, as we try to discern between this, what is actual fact and what's false interpretation on the fact, it's going to become very important. I dare say if you've been going to church for very long here, or if you have attended very many gospel meetings, this is the first spring gospel meeting that you've ever had where the topic is dinosaurs. I mean, who teaches? It's almost like you don't even want to say you're preaching a lesson on dinosaurs, because you almost don't even want to say that's part of the gospel, but it is. Let me tell you what I mean by that. When Jesus was at the well there in Samaria and all of his disciples had gone away and he was there and he was resting, and the woman from Samaria came to him and she started talking to Jesus, and he started explaining to her what she had done in her life. Hey, go get your husband. She said, well, I don't have a husband. He says, I know you've had 5 people. The one you have now is not your husband. She said, I perceive you're a prophet. She said, I realize you're from God. And so she asked him the firebrand question of the first century Samaritan Jewish conflict. Well, if you're a prophet, then where do you worship? Because my fathers say we worship here on Mount Gerizim. Your fathers say you got to worship in Jerusalem. So which is it? Now guess what? The question as to where to worship was going to make or break the religious discussion with this woman. Isn't that a silly question? Who has ever heard a lesson on a 45-minute lesson on where to worship? What if I stood up here tonight and said, this is a very important topic, guys. We need to know where to worship, and guess what? You can worship anywhere in the world that you want to. You can worship on this mountain. You can worship on that mountain. You can worship in Lebanon, Tennessee. You worship in Columbia, Tennessee. I've never preached a lesson like that. You know why? Because it's not an issue now. Was it an issue then? Absolutely positive. So if someone would have said, Jesus, why are you wasting your time? That's not core gospel stuff. Where to worship. It was for that lady. Something she had to get over. And I think what you're going to see is that with these issues, the idea of dinosaurs is a very, very important issue. Before we go to that, let me read for you. I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. And I'm going to read for you a statement from a person who sent us an email. And I believe this was a mother, and she said, this is so scary. I'm battling this with my 15, almost 16-year-old right now. I should have started earlier, but the things that affected me don't affect him and vice versa. Dinosaurs were the beginning of our problem. I'm so afraid of losing him to the world. Now, there are some of you sitting here, and dinosaurs have never posed any problem to you whatsoever. Unfortunately, there are some of you in here who have discounted dinosaurs altogether. And let me tell you what I mean by that. The generation before me, my parents' generation, they were told almost across the board dinosaurs never existed. They were just made up by evolutionists. There was never such a thing as a dinosaur, and you need to not inquire about them. Don't ask about them. Everything about dinosaurs is fake. There were no real dinosaur bones. They were artificially put into the ground. Dinosaurs are fake. That's what they were told in their classes in church when people asked about dinosaurs. And they would. My mother was teaching a ladies' class right outside of Columbia, Tennessee at Riggs Crossroad there. She had 13 ladies, and she was talking about this stuff and how their kids would come home from school with questions, and they needed to be prepared to answer those questions. And the ladies said, what do you mean? She said, well, questions about dinosaurs and things like that. And the lady said, well, the preacher before the one we've got now just told us dinosaurs never existed. And that we wouldn't need to answer those. We'd just tell them they never existed. That's going to be real problematic, isn't it? When you go out to Wyoming, like my coworker Jeff Miller did, and you start digging in the Wyoming desert-like ground with other people who believe in God and who are creationists, and you start digging this stuff off of private land, and you dig up a Tyrannosaurus Rex tooth that you randomly located in this massive dinosaur graveyard, how did it get put there? It wasn't artificially put there by humans. And so that idea of, hey, dinosaurs are fake, that's going to be a real problem. If you tell a 12-year-old that dinosaurs are fake, and then they open their textbook and they see a frame-by-frame situation where that dinosaur fossil was found in the ground, was dug up, was transported to the museum, and then they go to that very museum and they see the dinosaur fossil that was dug up in Wyoming. And they're going to start thinking, well, if my parents say dinosaurs were fake, and they're not, what else did my parents get wrong? You see how that would pose a problem? And so, as we start looking at this idea, we need to make sure that when we present an answer, it's one that's biblical, that's accurate, that's scientifically valid, and it makes good sense. Dinosaurs never existed doesn't make sense, and I'm going to show you why not only does it not make sense, but it robs God of information that He wants out there. And we'll see why that's the case. So, as we're looking at this, you ask yourself the question, what's the problem with dinosaurs? Where KJ said dinosaurs were where our problem started, what's the problem? Well, here's the problem. When did dinosaurs live? Trick question, obviously. When are we told, generally speaking, dinosaurs live? Now, you probably don't know all the history. You probably don't know that about 220 million years ago, supposedly a certain group of dinosaurs evolved, and then that group evolved over multiplied more millions of years, and then the ones that you see in most of these Jurassic Park movies are supposed to have been around in about 70 million years ago. And then a huge asteroid about 6 miles wide supposedly slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula and caused massive catastrophic happenings and killed the dinosaurs off. That's what we're told most of the time. And then if you follow this evolutionary scenario, then humans supposedly arrived on the scene about 5 million years ago in their pre-human primate state and evolved into something like humans about 3 million years ago. And so dinosaurs and humans are supposed to be separated by, you're looking at 60 million years. So what's the problem? Well, it's kind of like this. You had a couple guys that were out in the woods, and they look down at the woods floor and they see this big old hole, and they think, I wonder how deep that hole is. And so they pick up a handful of rocks and they throw it in the hole, and they don't hear the rocks hit, and they think we just need a bigger rock, so they find a football-sized rock and they throw it in the hole. Don't hear the rocks hit. Not the football-sized rock either, and so they think they need something bigger, so they look around and they see a railroad tie. They say, well, if this hole has a bottom, this railroad tie will find it. So one of them gets on one end, the other one gets on the other end, they heave in the hole and they shove this railroad tie, big old piece of wood railroad tie, into this hole. About 5 seconds later, this wild-eyed crazy goat comes running through the woods, jumps up in the air, fastest moving goat they've ever seen, shoots down the hole. They're thinking, what in the world is going on? Farmer comes by about 5 minutes later. He's obviously looking for somewhere in his overalls, looking around. The two guys see him. They say, hey, did you lose something? He said, yeah, I'm looking for something. They said, what you looking for? He said, I'm looking for my goat. They said, oh, yeah, we saw him about 5 minutes ago. He jumped up in there and shot down this hole. Farmer says, no, that's not my goat. So my goat's chained to a railroad tie. Sometimes things get connected and they get drug along when they don't need to be. Here's what's happened. That idea of evolution, the idea that somehow life evolved from non-living chemicals and multiplied over multiple millions or billions of years and changed from one kind of life to another kind of life. Incidentally, it violates the most fundamental law of biology, the law of biogenesis. You can't get life evolving from one kind to another. But what has happened is dinosaurs are so interesting. Evolutionists have taken dinosaurs and they've said, hey kids, aren't these awesome? And they've chained that idea of evolution to them, and anywhere dinosaurs go, evolution follows. It gets drug right along. In fact, they're almost inseparable these days. But I tell you what we're going to do this evening. We're going to cut that chain. We're going to break it. And so we're going to see that you can have dinosaurs and you can leave the false theory of evolution because you don't need it and it doesn't really fit with dinosaurs. And so let's begin to do that. Philip Kitcher, in his book, Abusing Science, Stephen Jay Gould was an evolutionist who read this book and basically said this is an amazing book. Kitcher was writing against creation and against the biblical framework, and he said, if you could find evidence that dinosaurs and humans lived together, then that would shake the foundations of evolutionary theory. Because he says, of course, the dinosaurs are supposed to have been long extinct by the time that hominids, that's the fancy word for humans, arrived. Now, let's go to the biblical framework. Day 1, God creates light. Day 2 creates the expanse. Day 3, he creates flowers, grass, and trees. Day 4, sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, birds and fish. Day 6, animals, land-living animals, and man. Let me ask you a quick question. What language do cavemen speak? That's a good question. Did cavemen come before or after Adam? Another good question. What in the world are cavemen? Now, here's what cavemen actually are. There were some humans that lived in caves. The way that you see cavemen presented, they are brute-browed, knuckle-dragging, imbecilic, pre-human creatures that can't even talk to the person they want to date. They just have to club her over the head. And, well, I saw some people like that in college, but they haven't. I mean, you're talking subhuman. Folks, that whole scenario is wrong. On day 6, God creates Adam. Adam is fully mature enough to converse with God, and he is given the task to name all the animals. All of them. Now, a little kid came up to me not long ago, and I presented that. They said, no way he did that. And I said, yeah, named all the animals. And this little kid was talking to me, and he said, do you mean he named every dog like Spot, Fluffy, Furry? I said, no. He didn't name every dog. He would name the dog kind, the cow kind, the horse kind. Now, we don't know what language he spoke. It was probably something really even before maybe some type of real ancient Hebrew. We have no idea. But it was intelligent enough to have a vocabulary at his disposal to name all of the kinds of animals. And at the end of it, there was not a kind of animal that was suitable to be a helper for him, and that was God's whole point, wasn't it? Hey, look out at everything I've made. There's nothing like you, is there? No, let me show you what's behind door number 2. Now, we don't have a problem with Adam naming the horse kind, do we? We don't have a problem with Adam naming the cow kind. But then when we say he would have also named the dinosaur kind, well, that's when people start saying, whoa. Sure, I thought Adam, humans, and dinosaurs are separated by million years. Well, couldn't those days have been millions? We're going to get into that. I'm going to show you that's not even biblically possible, and it's not historically possible either. But why do you have a problem thinking dinosaurs walked in front of Adam and he named them? But you don't have a problem thinking bears walked in front of Adam and he named them, or horses walked in front. Well, because every time you've ever read anything about dinosaurs, you've been taught in every single book, in every single magazine, every single video, dinosaurs and humans didn't live together. And you've been taught that because if you buy that, then evolution comes right along with it, chained to these magnificent creatures. And Kitcher knows that if you could prove dinosaurs and humans live together, you'd crush evolution. You wouldn't just be knocking off a branch. You'd be cutting it at the taproot. You're finishing the foundations if you can put humans and dinosaurs together. And so this is not a peripheral issue. This is not hey, let's entertain people on a Saturday night and have a little break from regular gospel preaching and talk about dinosaurs. This is a fundamental issue in the creation evolution discussion. And you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at Philip Kitcher. He says, look, now this is as technologically savvy as I get. If you don't like this, it's all down here. Go ahead and sleep from now on. Shake the foundations. You want to see it again? I mean, that right there, that's it. That's the best I've got for you. So, if that doesn't wake you up, then I'm sorry. This is Magic School Bus. Magic School Bus is PBS. Public Broadcasting System. Here's what that means. You pay taxes. The government decides what they're going to teach your kids on free PBS channels. This is the stuff. You see right here in the middle, well, this BC Boy comic, this is make-believe. Well, why is this make-believe? There were no dinosaurs in the time of cave people, according to your Magic School Bus book. Flory writes an article for us. No people ever saw a dinosaur. When early humans appeared on Earth, dinosaurs had already been dead for millions of years. People found out about dinosaurs from their fossils. That's not true. And yet every single book you ever read, virtually every single book, 99.99%. Now you can pick up some back on that table, or you can go find that stuff on our website absolutely free. That doesn't say that. But almost every single book you'll ever see, no human being ever saw a live dinosaur. No human being ever saw a live dinosaur. If you can convince a kid that no human being ever saw a live dinosaur, and then you take them to Genesis chapter 1, they're going to have a real problem with the story of creation. And evolutionists and Satan know that. And so they say, aren't Tyrannosaurus Rexes awesome? And no human being ever saw one. Well, that's just not true. And we're going to show you the physical evidence, and we're going to show you the biblical evidence and the historical evidence to validate that claim. If you want to put the most important piece of information that you think you've got in your paper, in your article, wherever, where do you put that? Generally speaking, two places. The very beginning and the very end. Now let me ask you this question. In this article, The Age of Dinosaurs, what was the author's most important piece of information he wants to get across? This idea that no human beings ever seen a live dinosaur. Now, I was delivering you couldn't even call it a lecture, because these kids were, I was probably 23. It was a lecture, actually, sadly. I was lecturing about 150 third graders and down. You can't lecture third graders and down. You've got to do something else. So you got to call it an interactive talk, something, but not a lecture. But at 23, I had started reading all this stuff and found it real fascinating. And so I got all these little kids, and we were on the floor of the Heritage University auditorium. And boy, for 30 minutes, I'm giving them all. I'm giving them what I give you tonight. Some of it, we added some, and now I got about 5 hours of it. But we're not going to do all that tonight. But anyway, I gave them about 30 minutes of it. And I thought I had done a perfect job. I thought I had nailed it. And I thought they would all answer correctly in unison when I asked, did dinosaurs and humans live together? And I had gone through the historical evidence, the biblical evidence, and the physical evidence, and I thought they would all say yes. They said no. I said, what? I said, I just spent 30 minutes talking to you about all the evidence that showed dinosaurs and humans lived together. Why in the world would you say they didn't? And one little kid raised his hand. And he said, because you put up on the screen a slide that said no human being's ever seen a live dinosaur. And I said, okay. All right. From now on, anytime that slide comes up, you're going to see a big red wrong on that. So that no kid will ever go out of any lesson I've ever done thinking that no human being has ever seen a live dinosaur. Humans have seen dinosaurs. And I'm going to validate that in a number of ways. This is the Natural Bridges National Monument. My co-worker, Eric Lyons, is standing there by the Natural Bridges sign. It's in Blanding, Utah. As you go to this particular natural bridge, it's the third largest in the world. It's the Kachina Natural Bridge. And here at the Kachina Natural Bridge, about 10 feet up on the rock cliff, here's me. About right here, you will see a bunch of Indian carvings that are very famous. Now, they're very famous because in one of these, you can't fake them. And what I mean by that is the way that they make these carvings. Maybe you can faintly see this one right here. I'm going to outline the interesting one for you. They take something like a chisel and they make hundreds of little dots that carves out the shape that they want. And then over hundreds of years of desert wear, it builds up a varnish that covers it. And so there's no possible way you can fake it. It's impossible to fake, and everybody who studies these recognizes that to be the case. So we go out there because we were reading in an evolutionist book on these carvings about this particular carving. It's the one that we actually, there was a tree trunk out there and we climbed up the 10 foot to the ledge there from the bridge, and Eric is standing on the rock ledge right next to a carving right here. It's real faint, but we've outlined it for you, and it looks like that. What does that look like to you? Just incidentally. Well, I've never run into anybody that says it looks like a horse. Never talked to anybody that says hippopotamus straight up. Never seen anybody that says an elephant. Everybody that I've talked to that says, okay, what does that look like? It just looks like a long-tailed, long-necked, big plant-eating dinosaur. Now, there's a reason Eric and I are out there. It's not because we saw this for the first time and thought it looked like a long-tailed, long-necked dinosaur. It's because the evolutionists themselves recognized the fact. And so these Indians were carving in maybe about 1000 AD, only about 1,000 years ago or so. This is a quote from one of the evolutionists who is an expert on the rock art. That's what he does. He studies this Indian rock art. And here's what he says about this. He says, there is a petroglyph in the Natural Bridges National Monument that bears a... Excuse me, was that startling to you? Startling? Okay, it bears a what kind of resemblance? Startling resemblance. Now let's unpack that word startling. Startling means something you don't expect it. Now probably the best illustration of startling that I know. Several years ago, my mom gave birth to 3 boys. She said she raised 4, counting my dad. And it's because he would do things like this. He brought home a 6-foot-long black snake and thought me and my 2 brothers needed a new pet. And so he threw it at us in a burlap sack that he got from the feed room there at the barn and said, here you go, guys, new pet. And, oh, this was run of the mill for us. So, man, we had a 6-foot-long black snake. It was, harmless. And then we thought, this is great. This is exciting. So we played with it for a little while. And then we got an old aquarium that didn't have any water in it, and we put that black snake in there and put it in this little, it was kind of like a screened off porch to our house. And it had a little way you could kind of get out under the place. It wasn't like in the house, it was out of it a little bit. We put it out there, put a rock on the top and thought, oh man, it's great, we'll wake up tomorrow, play with it some more. Woke up the next day. Our security measures were insufficient to contain said reptile, and it was gone. Now, we weren't real diligent about trying to find it. We looked around, we didn't see it anywhere in the little screened-in porch. We figured it went right under the little door, no problem. So, oh, rats, we'll get another one later. 3 days later, my mom goes into her closet to get a pair of shoes. Why is that funny? I mean, you guys go into your closets and get pairs of shoes all the time. I mean, nothing big there. We hear a blood-curdling scream, and she is startled. Yes, why? Because she's looking for shoes, and she finds a 6-foot-long black snake. Would that startle you? Yeah, because that's not what you're looking for. If you're an evolutionist, and you study rock art from a group of people that lived 1,000 years ago, and one of the carvings looks just like a long-tailed, long-necked dinosaur, is that startling to you? Oh yeah. Because that's not what you expect. You're going looking for shoes and you're finding a 6-foot-long black snake. You're going looking for an ibex and you're finding a 116-ton apatosaurus. Yes, this is very startling. In fact, we went up to the office there at the place where the Natural Bridges National Monument is, and the girl said, where'd you guys go this morning? We said, well, we went down to Kachina Natural Bridge. She said, you see the weird carving? And we played a little along. We said, the weird one, what are you talking about? She said, the one that looked like a dinosaur. We said, oh yeah, we did. In fact, that was the whole reason we were there. We said, yeah, we saw the one that looked like a dinosaur. We said, how do they explain it? She said, well, it was too early to be a horse. Does it look like a horse to anybody? What they meant by that was that the horses hadn't been brought over by the Spanish conquistadors yet, but it didn't look like a horse. And so we said, well, how do they explain it? She said, they don't want to. She said, some people think it's a dinosaur, but they're crazy. Do you know every 3rd grader I've ever showed that to says it looks like a dinosaur? You know why? Because 3rd graders are crazy. or because it looks just like a dinosaur and they are not brainwashed enough yet to say it couldn't be. And they call a spade and they say, hey, it looks just like a dinosaur. And if those Indians lived in 1000, they carved that, what are you going to say about it? That's really the tip of the iceberg that proves that no human being's ever seen a live dinosaur is absolutely wrong. Continue with me. This is, I don't know what you get your mom for Mother's Day. Javarim in the 7th, even after she named him this, he felt like he needed to give his mom a series of temples. Now, most of the time I just used to get my mom flowers. This guy took it one step further, built for her a huge series of temples. In this series of temples, you will find carvings. Look like an Indiana Jones movie, really. But on one of the carvings, you see animals. Something like, maybe maybe a water buffalo's got horns and small tail. And then you see this carving. Now, here's the problem if you don't want to say that's a dinosaur. Most of the time when you show this to somebody, they say it looks like a dinosaur. If I were then to say more specifically what kind of dinosaur, now here's what happens. Lots of the kids under 12 can tell me exactly what kind of dinosaur that looks like. The people 12 and up have a problem with it most of the time. A lot of you are looking like maybe a Brachiosaurus. Any guesses there? Stegosaurus meaning a plated or armored lizard because of those plates. Now here's the problem. See this little black stuff? That is patina. It builds up in the temples. We know for a fact these temples were built in 1187 AD. Know for a fact. You can't fake this patina. It's impossible. This is the exact same kind of black stuff on the whole temple. Plus there's 40 tons of rock above this, so there's no way you could slide it out and put it in. Now if you don't want to say that's a dinosaur, specifically a stegosaurus, then you got to call it something else. What I was reading, a guy who was adamantly opposed to the idea that dinosaurs and humans live together, they said, no, that's not a dinosaur, it's a pig with bushes behind it. I did not know they had professional landscapers back then. That's amazing. Landscape those bushes right on that thing's back. And that tail is remarkably large for a pig. Most porcine that I have seen have a tail that is not that type of ratio to the body. If you were to see a picture of a stegosaurus and you were to compare that to the picture of the stegosaurus, it's remarkably similar. In fact, so remarkably similar that if you were to put the two pictures beside each other, people would just say, yeah, it looks like a stegosaurus. It's that the problem for the evolutionists is we know for a fact it was carved in 1187 AD, for a fact. So if you got something that's carved in 1187 AD, it looks just like a stegosaurus with plates on its back. Well, here's what's interesting. When we first started finding a stegosaurus, we didn't know how those plates fit. We put them on flat because we thought it was armor that went flat down on the stegosaurus. And then we realized, no, they stood up. And yet this carving in 1187 AD has got something that looks just like a stegosaurus with plates that are already standing up. That idea no human being's ever seen a live dinosaur, wrong. Oh, now this is very interesting. They found a Tyrannosaurus rex femur, the large bone in the leg. And when you dig up a fossil, you don't dig up the stuff. You dig up a rock in the shape of the stuff. I've got a coprolite that I carry around to schools when I talk about dinosaurs. Anybody know what a coprolite is? A coprolite is fossilized dinosaur manure. And it's just in the shape of a small dinosaur manure. It's fossilized. When you're holding it, you're holding a rock in the shape of fossilized dinosaur manure. Now, if I pass it to a kid, now here's why it's very interesting. It tells us what the dinosaurs used to eat. In fact, we found in Tyrannosaurus rex coprolites, we have found shards of Triceratops bones and things like that. So it tells us a lot about life for a dinosaur. But when I'm holding a coprolite, I don't need to go wash my hands after I get done holding it because it's just a rock. That's what a fossil is. Found a Tyrannosaurus rex fossil, they thought, broke it open and realized, hold on just a second, this stuff hadn't been turned to rock. In fact, not only has it been not turned to rock, there's still soft tissue in it. Now this bone was supposed to be 70 million years old. They found soft tissue in it, tissue that when they pulled it apart and let it go back, it was so elastic, it shot back together. The lady who found the stuff did her experiments 5 times before she announced them because she thought she was going to lose her job. Now, why do you think you're going to lose your job when you find soft tissue in a 70 million year old Tyrannosaurus Rex femur? A pretty easy reason, isn't it? It's not 70 million years old. There's no mechanism that would keep soft tissue around for 20,000 years, much less 70 million. Do you know what should have happened when they found this Tyrannosaurus Rex femur that they broke open and it wasn't even fossilized? Not only was it not fossilized, but they found soft tissue in it. They should have said, we have been terribly wrong. This could only be a few hundred or 1,000 years old. There's no way it could be millions. Instead, what they said was, didn't know soft tissue could last 70 million years. Folks, that's like putting a jar of jelly on your kitchen counter open and coming in 3 days later and claiming you've been gone for 5,000 years and there be jelly still in the jar and it's still soft and almost still, you could put it on toast, and they say, oh, didn't know jelly would last 5,000 years. Jelly doesn't last 5,000 years. You've got your dates wrong there. So you could actually do this all night, and some of you think we have been doing this all night, and it's time to move on to the Bible section of our discussion. Okay, let's do. Just open your Bibles to the place that mentions dinosaurs. I'll wait, and if one of you can just read that out loud, that'll be great. In fact, I'll just stand here and wait until someone does. Okay, Book of Job. Now, let me rephrase it. Turn in your Bibles to the place that uses the word dinosaur. Okay, see, of course, we're not going to have any takers there. Now, some people have said, well, because I don't read the word dinosaur in my Bible, then that means God didn't create them or they're not in the Bible. Turn your Bibles to the place that mentions kangaroos, koala bears, dodo birds, saber-tooth tigers. You know, there's lots of stuff that's not mentioned specifically in the Bible. Now, I'm going to suggest to us that the word dinosaur is, well, I'm going to explain to us, which you already know. The word dinosaur is an English word. It was invented. The word was invented in 1841, 1842. So if there is a dinosaur specifically mentioned in the Bible, guess what it won't be called? It won't be called a dinosaur because the word wasn't invented in Bible writing time. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Pentateuch in 1450 BC. The word dinosaur wasn't invented until 1842. You're talking about 3,300 years separating the word. So if we read about a dinosaur, it's not going to be called a dinosaur. But now, let's go back to, maybe there's not a specific mention of a dinosaur, although I think there is. Even if there's not, that wouldn't matter, because there's not a koala bear, of a kangaroo, etc. But we know God made koalas and kangaroos, etc. How do we know that? Because we've got this statement. It's real simple, real easy. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. Did dinosaurs live on the earth? Would that include all that is in them? Yes, all that is in them. Now, some people have tried to say, well, maybe those days were millions and millions of years. Here's the problem with that. In Exodus chapter 20, you might recall this is the context of the 10 Commandments. Do you remember what commandment this is? Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. And then it explains, and ceased creating on the 7th day. Therefore you work for 6 days and stop working on the 7th day. Now, easy, simple question. Could God make the world in 6 seconds if he wanted? 6 nanoseconds? 6 picoseconds? 6, I don't even know what's below a picosecond. Sure, if he wanted. He could have, in a blink of an eye, made everything. Could he have made it in 6 billion years if he wanted? Sure. How long does he tell us it took him? 6 days. Now, when a person says, yeah, but could those have been millions of years? No, and here's why. When God said to the Israelites, you work for 6 days, How long did they understand those days to be? 6 days of 24 hours. And you rest for one day. How long did they understand that day to be? 24 hours. I mean, you're not going to get away with, God, maybe that last day, that Sabbath day was millions and millions of years. I think I'm going to take a little bit more of a break than the average work week. You work for 6 days, work for 6 periods of 24 hours, rest for one day, rest for one day of 24 hours. Why did God make the world in 6 literal 24-hour days? To give us a pattern for a work week. Did you know there's not a natural phenomenon that accounts for the 7-day work week? And yet from the beginning of human history, we've always had that. You understand that for the last, 7,000 years, humanity at large has had a 7-day work week, not because there's a moon cycle, not because there's a sun cycle. We've got a 7-day work week for one reason. God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. He told the Israelites to rest 1 literal 24-hour day, making a 7-day week, and it's been that way from the beginning of human history. Now, that's all you can read in this context. And so, God says He made everything in 6 days. He tells you when He made the land-living animals and when He made the people. Made people on day 6, land-living animals on day 6. If it's a land-living animal, when did He make it? Day 6. Koala bears, are they land-living animals? What day did He make them? Kangaroos, land-living animals? This is not rocket surgery, folks. This is actually pretty easy. Here we go. Dinosaurs, Tyrannosaurus Rex, land-living animals. What day did He make it? 6. That's it. It really is that simple. Honestly. And as you continue to go, let's not leave it with the specific. Let's get a little bit more, with the general. Let's get a little more specific. Maybe now here's why I think that it's so valuable to talk about dinosaurs. God lets Satan do horrible things to Job. Horrible. And Job wants an answer from God. And says to God, God, I'll tell you what, I really think I'm right here, and I don't think you've treated me fair, and I think if you let me talk to you face to face, then you'll realize my case is pretty strong. The only problem, Job says, is if you come down in all your glory, you'll kill me just by looking at you. And so if you will just somehow come talk to me without blasting me to pieces, then I think you'll see that I'm right. And I want some answers to why I'm suffering so bad. And here's what's interesting. God doesn't give him one answer. He just gives him a list of stuff to look at. And He says, I want you to look at the world that I created out of nothing. And I want you to look at how the eagle flies. And I want you to look at the wild donkey. And I want you to look at the wild oxen. And then He comes and says, and I want you to look at the behemoth. Now here's what's so interesting to me. Job comes to God asking for an answer to his suffering. And God says, I'm not answering your question. I want you to look at what I make. And when you look at what I make, you'll realize something. He asked Job, he says, Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the world? What's Job's answer to that? I don't know. Job, do you know how to make an eagle fly? Do you know for all the planes and everything we've got, we can't even yet mimic a flying eagle? Job, can you feed all of the animals every day at once like I do? And then he says, and I want you to look at the behemoth. Now notice this, which I made along with you. What is this word? Now, when you translate a word, in English, we've got the word dog. In Spanish, we've got the word perro. That's a not good R roll. I'm sorry, Forrest Hunter. I'm just not a R roller. I've tried. In fact, I spent months and months with a pencil under my tongue trying to get my tongue to do the little R roll. It won't do it. But to say perro right in Spanish, to get the dog word, you got to be able to roll your R. Can't do it. However, dog and perro don't sound anything alike. They're the same animal, but they don't sound alike. That's a translation. Now, what if you have a word like Kyle Butt in English, and you want to get it over to Spanish, but there's no translation for it? What do you then just do in Spanish? You just say Kyle Butt. You are talking about the hombre from the United States of America, and then when you get to his name, you say Kyle Butt. Okay, you transliterate it. You just make it sound like it sounds in the original language. No problem. What does behemoth sound like in Hebrew? Oh, sounds like behemoth. You guys can read Hebrew. You know that. I can't read much Hebrew, but behemoth's about all I can read. You know why? Because guess what the first sound of the word behemoth is in Hebrew? Ba. Guess what the second sound is? Ha. Third sound, ma. Fourth sound, tha. Behemoth. Here's what they came across. They came across this word in Job, and they said, we don't have any clue what that animal is. So we're going to let you guys figure it out, and we're not going to even try to translate it. We're just going to make it sound just like it sounds in Hebrew. So, as you're reading Hebrew, this all sounds like Hebrew stuff, and then it says, behemoth, which behemoth. That's what it sounds like in Hebrew. So what is a behemoth? Great question. The translators of the 1901 American Standard. I like the 1901 American Standard. It's getting a little dated as far as its English goes, but I like it as far as it keeps to the text. But here's what they said. This is the text, but this is a translator's side note. This is not Bible. This is not Scripture. They said, well, it's supposed to be an elephant or a hippopotamus. Interesting. Well, it's real easy to figure that out. Let's read about the behemoth and see if the description matches an elephant or a hippopotamus. Let's just see. He eats grass like an ox. Oh, okay. Strength is in his hips, his power's in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. Okay? Like a cedar, what does that mean in the Bible? Well, incidentally, the word cedar means something really, really massively, humongously big and long or tall. Notice Psalm 92, the righteous shall grow like a cedar. Assyria was a cedar of high stature, whose height was like the height of the cedars, one of the highest branches of the high cedars. Whatever this behemoth is, swings his tail like a massively large tree. Now, the cedars that we've got around here, not really coming close to the cedars of, well, maybe coming close to, the cedars of Lebanon. Yes, all right. But the cedars of Lebanon here are not the same as the scriptural cedars of Lebanon, because this is what the cedars of Lebanon look like. You're talking 6 grown adult men at the base of one of these trees, 150 feet tall or so, massively large. When God wanted to talk about something really big, really tall, really massive, He said it was like a cedar. Now, let's go back to our translator's note. It said it's supposed to be an elephant or hippopotamus. Well, there's a problem with that. Problem with it is, not like a cedar, not like a cedar. Do we have one like a cedar? Okay, now listen. If you get to a description of a creature that God said He made along with Job, that God is using to show His awesomeness, and you know for a fact that there used to be a creature that lived that was 6 times the size of a hippopotamus, whose tail was as big as a hippopotamus, why wouldn't you say this was probably a big, huge plant-eating dinosaur? I'll tell you why. Because every book you've ever read, every magazine you've ever seen, every video you've ever watched has told you that no human being's ever seen a live dinosaur, and that's false. It's wrong. Now, behemoth has a tail that he swings like a cedar, and we know there was a creature that existed that had just exactly such a tail. But for some reason, the translators, wanting to fit in with modern scholarship, don't want to say. If there was a land-living animal right now bigger than an elephant, do you think they would have used it? Yeah. But they sure don't want to use a dinosaur, because they've always been told that no human being's ever seen a live dinosaur, and that is absolutely positively wrong. What does history say about it? I'm going to have to speed through this. The fact of the matter is, in history, you wouldn't read about them being called dinosaurs, because the word wasn't invented until 1842. You would read about them being called something else. What was that most likely? Dragon. The word dragon was a word that was used for animals. Now, it's been embellished, and the modern mythological writing has embellished that idea of a dragon tremendously. But when you start looking at the natural history writings of the past, they would say dog, furry, canine-like creature with the tail. Then they would say deer looks like this. Dragon looks like this. Dragon was right in line with every other natural animal that was being written about. As you start looking at this, don't have time to get through all the dragon legends, the ubiquity of them, meaning they're from all over the world. The implacable mutual hostility between man and dragon is worldwide. Not only is it worldwide, but it goes back 3,000 years. There is one creature remembered in the legends of almost every human culture that ever existed: the Chinese, Aztecs, Inuit, Eskimos. In a frozen land where no reptiles are found, even they have stories of this animal, the dragon. Cultures from different continents, people who had no contact with one another, everybody talks about a dragon, and guess what they call it? Well, they say it was a big serpentine-like, lizard-like creature, had scales, bony knobs, had long serpentine necks, tail, stout legs, horn, knobby, crested head, fearsome teeth, claws, spikes, with or without bat-like wings, with 2 or 4 legs. And then there was this. Oh, that was dramatic. What's that look like to you? It's just like what you would see as a dragon. In fact, it's called a Draco Rex, Dragon King. It's a dinosaur fossil that they actually named it Draco Rex Hogwartsia, the Dragon King of Hogwarts, if you've read any Harry Potter. There. It's a dragon or a dinosaur that is exactly what you would think of as a dragon. In fact, the people who found it said, when we saw this creature's head, we weren't sure what kind of dinosaur it was. Its spiky horns, bumps, and long muzzle looked more like a dragon. Here's what you got. Physical evidence that shows that people in 1000 BC carved stuff look just like dinosaurs. Biblical evidence that shows God made humans and dinosaurs together at the exact same time on the same day. Adam named them, and he recognized their awesomeness, but realized they weren't for him, and Eve was brought onto the scene. You've got Job, that when he goes to question God, God says, hold on, Job, I'm not answering your question, but look at this creature that I made along with you. Now, what was God's point? Job, this dinosaur, this behemoth, this massive creature is so big, I made him. What does that mean about me compared to you, Job? Well, Job got the point. When he saw this animal who swung a tail like a cedar, the Bible says he covered his mouth and said, I have uttered things that I didn't know anything about. He said, I should have never said anything. What's the point? I could explain to you in the next 30 minutes how dinosaurs, probably most all of them, got killed in the flood, and that flood caused massive dinosaur graveyards all over the world, and that idea of a big meteor crashing into the Yucatan Peninsula doesn't make any sense, because there was stuff then like sharks and turtles and crocodiles that were reptilian that are still alive, and the people who believe in evolution suggest that they were around at the same time as those dinosaurs. So the crocodiles, the turtles, the sharks, they didn't die out, but all the dinosaurs did. You see the problem with that? The best explanation for what happened to the dinosaurs: a massive flood kills most every single dinosaur there is except the ones on the ark. And then you say, whoa, how you get a dinosaur on the ark? Who's feeding the Tyrannosaurus Rex? But then you realize God never said go get the biggest 2 creatures you can find. In fact, the biggest dinosaur egg we've ever found is about 24 inches long. Could God have brought a newly hatched pair of the different kinds of dinosaurs to Noah to put on that ark? Would it have saved space and food, etc.? Sure. Dinosaurs fit into the Bible perfectly. The evidence doesn't fit the evolutionary scenario, but here's what makes me so angry. The evolutionists have hijacked God's creatures. There was a specific design to dinosaurs, and that specific design was to bring glory to God. Now let me ask you this question. In the 21st century American society where we live, do dinosaurs get the chance to bring glory to God most of the time? No. In fact, when we have an opportunity to show our children how awesome God is with these creatures, sometimes we say, well, God didn't really even make those creatures. They're just made up. So here's what I'm saying. It's time we take dinosaurs back and we use them for what God designed them to be used for in the first place. And that's when our kids come home with a book on dinosaurs that they picked up at the book fair, and they say, Mom, Dad, Grandma, Granddad, look at this book on dinosaurs. Aren't they amazing? You say, yeah, they are. Sit down right here. Let's talk about them. Let me tell you about the Tyrannosaurus Rex. Had a huge 5.5-foot skull. Isn't God amazing? Perfectly designed those teeth. Isn't He wonderful? Was able to make a 116-ton plant-eating dinosaur that was engineered to swallow rocks so it could digest its own food. Isn't God awesome? And every time we see something like that, a tiny little hummingbird or a massive blue whale or anything in between, we should point our children from that amazing creature to that amazing Creator. And when it comes to dinosaurs, we haven't done that. And it's time we take them back. And it's also time that we see how God used them to convince Job that God knows what He's talking about. I say never did answer Job. He didn't say, Job, this is why. He just said, Job, this is who I am. And when you see who God is and ultimately recognize the truth of that, it really answers your questions. When you come to God and you ask, well, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? And you see Jesus Christ hanging on that cross, God doesn't really have to even say anything other than to point to the sacrifice and say, this is who I am. This is what I'll give up for you. What will you give up for me? You see, when God, through Peter on that first Pentecost after the resurrection, had those people who crucified Jesus in that audience and they realized what they had done, Peter pointed them to Jesus and said, this is who God is. And they realized what they had done, and they said to Peter, what do we do? Here's what God's done for you. What's your response? Peter gave them the exact same message that is still just as powerful 2,000 years removed from that first sermon. He said, repent and let every one of you be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit, for the promises to you and to your children and to those who are far off, to as many as the Lord our God shall call. And how does the Bible say He calls people? Through the gospel. He's calling you tonight. Not from some quiet voice that is in your head, not from some massive. He's calling you through the gospel. And He's saying, will you give your life for me because I've given mine for you? Do you need to respond to the Lord's invitation? If you do, I hope you will as we stand and as we sing.